know, if you look at the federal government today, you would think the federal government created the states. They didn't. The states created the federal government. And yet, the states have become so dependent on the federal government. Take New York. They're predicting a budget deficit in New York of some $9 billion. But worse than that, if you look at the funds that come from the federal government in grants, Medicaid reimbursements, 30% of the revenue of New York State comes from the federal government. What does that tell you? We are very, very vulnerable. If the federal government is in trouble, we know it is, what's the state going to be if we're dependent on the federal government? So we need to get leaders in Albany. And don't forget, as a U.S. Senator, I go to Washington, but I represent New York. I represent you if you live in New York. And I must weigh in on those problems in Albany, and they have the same problems as the United States of America. Now, let me show something to you, because I did this 25 years ago, and I'm doing it today, and it's on the cover of my book. This is a congressman and a congresswoman's voting card. And 25 years ago, I stood on the House floor when I realized, putting this in the computer to vote, that every time I voted, since we had deficits, even under Ronald Reagan, you remember Graham Rudman, we tried to get rid of those deficits over 4 years. Every time I put this in, I was raising the national debt. Now, you have credit cards, but there's a big difference between this credit card, this most expensive credit card in the world, a congressman's, and yours. When you reach the limit, you have the sense to change your behavior. You might eliminate a vacation. You certainly will start cutting your spending because you don't want to be put out of your house. You don't want to lose your job. Not the federal government. What do? They keep raising the limit. It's called the debt limit. And what did they do this year? It just happened. The debt limit was $12.1 trillion. And forgive me if I miss a B or a T. These are big numbers. But $1 trillion, 12.1. Now, what did they do? They raised it almost $2 trillion to almost $14 trillion. Now, what would Joe DioGuardi have done if he was in the Senate? I would know that we'd have to raise it somewhat, because if you don't raise the debt limit, the country cannot operate. They'll be putting you on lines again at the Statue of Liberty. Things close down. But why raise it $1.9 trillion? Why not $100 billion or $200 billion at a time, so that it's painful for Congress to come back on the floor, to pass that vote, and justify why they're not balancing the budget? Does that make sense to you? Okay. Well, that's the kind of person I am.